Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and our dear audience, those who have tuned in with the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada's webinar series, episode 5. Today, we are very fortunate to have very important personalities from Winnipeg, and we are extremely proud to host them in today's session. And before I introduce the speakers, let me acknowledge the territories where Conflict and Resilience Research Institute is operating from. We are located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to speak on two very important topics. One from the Executive Director of ECOM and followed by one of the Rotarians and Peacebuilder from Winnipeg. So let me introduce the speakers first. Dorota Blumczynksa is from Poland and she moved into Winnipeg in 1989. And she worked her way up and she assumed the leadership role in the ECOM Winnipeg, Manitoba from 2010. And let me read a little bit from her LinkedIn profile because that is very important to describe her passion. She is very passionate and driven leader with a decade of executive experience. A visionary who sees possibility in all situations, turns challenges into optimism in work and life. She is a strategic thinker, agile and adept team player, and she is very compassionate and people-centered. And most importantly, I do follow her blog that she regularly updates in IRCOM site. And those who are not very familiar with the institution, IRCOM stands for Immigrant and Refugee Community Organizations of Manitoba. So I'm going to read just one paragraph of her recent blog, which is fascinating. So she was saying in her latest blog that, and she was critiquing some of the state actions with regards to immigrants and refugees. So I here quote, some actions are unjustified, no matter how afraid we feel. Closing the border to refugee claimants is one such action. It abandons the rule of law, and it is the rule of law that is keeping the world from spiraling into chaos. The rule of law restricts the arbitrary exercise of power by agreeing that power is less important than adhering to well-defined and established laws. People and nations agree that this code protects everyone, those with privilege, power, and resources, and those without. This assures safety and a chance of survival to everyone, not solely to the mightiest powers. I unquote. So this is one of the fascinating part of her blog I always loved. So without further ado, let me welcome the Executive Director of IRCOM, Dorota Blumczynksa. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Kausar. Well, it's an honor to be part of these conversations. It's a very dynamic time right now. I think it's very important to begin with reference to what is happening in the world. I imagine everyone is fully aware that there is a fight for justice in Canada, in the United States, a fight for justice globally. And it is centered around police brutality and around brutality by authoritarianism and powers that suppress the rights and the liberties and the freedoms and the lives, specifically of Black people. But depending on the community, it is people of color, Indigenous peoples, minority communities. And it's sparking a conversation that has regrettably been brought to the surface many, many times in history, and yet has not created the kind of change that actually dismantles systems, those very systems, and doesn't lead to a lasting and enduring framework that honors human rights and the rights of every single individual. So I start with that because I think it's critical to understand the world that we're living in, and if not to understand, then to seek to understand and to ask questions and to have an open mind and to try to have a listening ear and a compassionate heart, but also a willingness to step into a very uncomfortable space in order to create that change. And I say this because in my role as executive director of IRCOM, I consider myself very, very privileged to lead a dynamic organization, and an organization that is seeking to create lasting change in our communities. But I lead an organization from a position of privilege. As a white woman, I've noted this and I've spoken about it. That privilege makes it impossible for me to ever truly understand and internalize the impacts of racism. And the majority of my colleagues, and almost entirely the community that I have the honor of serving every single day, are people of color. And so that is an experience that we do not share. And thus it makes it complicated for how I can live into the expectations of my leadership, and how I can be of greatest support and the greatest ally and the greatest advocate without fully internalizing what it means to suffer oppression. And I struggle with this, and it is a journey. It's deeply complicated. But what has brought me into this work is that my family did arrive as refugees 30 years ago. We came as privately sponsored refugees. We spent about 14 months in a refugee camp in Eastern Germany after having left Poland. I just want to sort of clarify that the refugee experience is on an enormous continuum. No one experience is the same as another. People are coming from active conflict zones. People are coming from oppressive governments. People are coming from democratic countries that still oppress minorities. So it is very different for every single individual, and as different as those experiences are, as are their specific journeys and refugee camps. So I just want to say that because there's an idea in the dominant narrative about what a refugee camp looks like, and it's often what we see in media. But refugee camps, people will tell you from their lived experience, are apartment buildings, or they're in cities and they're complexes, and some of them are gated and fenced in, and some of them are simply in among community. And so there's no one experience, and there's no one sort of limbo in which people find themselves as they're seeking to be resettled or find a new home. But that experience, the experience of leaving home, and the experience of displacement, and then the experience of resettlement and migration are very difficult. They're very difficult on anyone who experiences them, because it is there's a grief to it, and there's a loss to it. There's a sense of uncertainty, and there's such a profound desire to want to belong, and a profound desire to be valued, and a profound desire to create a meaningful life. And perhaps that is the thread that I know that I do share with my community, is that desire to belong and to be valued, and to create a life of dignity, and a life that respects human rights, and a life that offers opportunity. But I fully know that I simply do not and will not face the same challenges and the same barriers because of the color of my skin. My work at IRCOM for the last 12 and a half years and in leadership for the last 10 years has been an extraordinary learning opportunity. I think I could say easily that there hasn't been a day without a challenge, and a day that hasn't called upon me to increase my capacity or step into a space that was unfamiliar or navigate a situation or waters that I had no exposure to and no preparedness for. It's been an opportunity to work alongside and journey with people. IRCOM as an organization is a social service organization. It is an organization that thrives in its love of people, in its honoring of the story of all people. It, as a community, wants to both listen but also amplify the voices of those who wish to share their stories. But we're also deeply dedicated to creating change. We have many internal conversations about what it means to provide exceptional service. So safe, affordable, transitional housing, what it means to ensure that people have access to language programs or pre-employment programs or programs for children and youth. But we have that discussion with a wider view of the world. So what we are fully aware of is that we serve 500, 600, 700, 800 people, and yet within our community, there are 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000. And so the work that we do is very limited unless we also dedicate ourselves to changing the conditions upstream. And so we have that duality in our vision and in our mission. And that is not only to do the work on the ground, but also to head up and make sure that we are actively working to change policies, to change systems, to dismantle them, to challenge them. And that requires an ability to reflect and to have those difficult conversations. The conversations that we've been having because of COVID have been very dynamic. Not only have we had to, as an organization, I'm so sorry. Thank you. No, sorry. Not only have we had to have conversations as a community about changing the way we provide our services, but what we've also had to do is talk about what is our role when the borders are closed, and what is our role, both as a small community, but as part of a larger national community, in terms of working with government to continue refugee resettlement and to continue to honor international agreements and to continue to uphold the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which assures everyone the ability to submit a refugee claim at any point in time because they have a well-founded fear of persecution. And the closure of our borders in mid-March was a very difficult moment for our national community, the community of refugees and refugee allies and refugee advocates, because it was unprecedented. And it flew so much in the face of what many of us believed this country stood for. And the thought that we would close specifically the border between Canada and the US with the idea that the United States would assure the safety of those who would be turned away at that border was very naive, and it was very negligent. And aside from being completely illegal, it compromised the lives and the liberty of every single individual who felt that Canada was on a journey towards that ideal that it certainly advertises globally, that it is compassionate and humanitarian, and yet it failed. It failed enormously in that moment. And so we sit and wait as to when refugee resettlement will resume. But we know that that is a very complicated landscape. Refugee resettlement is not something Canada does in isolation. It involves the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It involves the International Organization for Migration. It involves international NGOs. It involves often private sponsors who are bringing privately sponsored refugees over, as well as government-assisted refugees. It requires visa officers placed internationally to be able to do the administrative processes of identifying refugees for resettlement. So Canada's intent has to be met by its willingness to act, but also its ability and its willingness to force the hands or encourage the resumption of refugee resettlement internationally. Because where we are right now is that we, as a country and as a community, we've set these national targets that in the next 3 years we hope to welcome 1 million newcomers. We already know halfway through 2020 that we're not going to meet these targets. We're not going to meet the target of 2020. We also know and have heard so much that newcomers, immigrants and refugees are at the forefront of the COVID fight, that they are ensuring food security, that they are ensuring good health care, that they are ensuring adequate supplies for everyone throughout all of our communities, and meaningfully contributing. And so our ability as a country to continue to build this nation requires us to not only be actively resettling people in Canada and continuing to welcome them, but also creating an atmosphere that ensures that they can actually build a life here, that they're not placed into factory lines or into solely through an employment lens or labor market lens, but that in fact we are creating an opportunity for everyone to belong and to integrate and to have a voice and to live and breathe and enjoy democracy. And so one opportunity that COVID in some respects has placed on us is that right now there are over 91,000 refugee claimants and refugees already within Canada who are waiting a decision. Some have waited for a decision in excess of 2 years. In the meantime, they have been permitted, as is their legal right, to work. And so for 2 years, the vast majority have worked. They have been working and continue to work as they continue to wait for an opportunity to have their story heard. We know that well over 66% of refugee claims are returned positive, which means that they are conferred with refugee status within Canada. And that not only includes the person who's within Canada, but that is also extended to their dependent family, wherever they are abroad. So right now in Canada, there are over 91,000 people who are waiting for a decision. And so while others are not able to arrive here in the same numbers, we have the chance to create a robust system that is an interim system in response to COVID, that ensures that it still follows good process, but that renders decisions very quickly and regularizes the status of as many of those individuals as possible, so that they can immediately not only have the security of permanent residence, but then also begin to truly build their lives and then prepare to welcome their families when they are reunited. Because we know that when the world begins to move yet again, and it certainly will at some point begin to move en masse, that we will find ourselves in conversation about what is our capacity. And our capacity before the world shut down was insufficient. When the world reopens and when those who seek Canada's protection make their way to Canada, when they want to have their story heard, it is our responsibility to ensure that we are well resourced so that it is not our lack of capacity that denies them justice. And so processing those who are already in Canada during this moment of global silence in some ways, or lack of global movement, is a chance to remove that backlog very, very quickly, and then position us to uphold what we fundamentally believe is critical in terms of supporting refugee claimants, which is the right to have your story heard, the right to an opportunity to present your case for refugee claim, the right to a system that is well equipped and a system that is fair and transparent. And so that is the opportunity that COVID in some ways offers us right now, is a chance to move through that backlog, and also a chance to prepare and a chance to reform and a chance to strengthen the system with an understanding that justice is expensive. But if justice doesn't cost us anything, if it isn't uncomfortable, if it doesn't push our limits and stretch us, then it's ineffective. Because it has to be through pain that we actually create change. So that's what I wanted to share today.
Thank you very much, Dorota, for I would say very speak, and I really appreciate a couple of very interesting points that Dorota shared with us, and I learned myself quite a lot while I was preparing for the webinar from her blogs, from her institution's website. So thank you very much, Dorota, for your presentation, and we'll be talking to you a little later after during the question and answer session. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to introduce my mentor, my guide and philosopher, David Gerald Newman. And many of you know him, I'm sure, in this city. He's a lifelong Winnipegger. He was born here, and most important part, the way I met him in 2010 when I landed as a resident here and started my education. Since then, he guides me, and for the audience, he is also an advisor to the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute. David has worked in many places, including in the government in 1997. But let me not go to the long list of his service elsewhere. But just to let you know and share with the audience that he co-chairs and he's the founder of Peacebuilding Committee of Rotary Club of Winnipeg. He is the chair and co-founder as well of Rotary District 5550 World Peace Partners, and board member of Honoring Indigenous People, and also on Honoring Indigenous People Committee of the Rotary Club of Winnipeg. And David has a very strong passion for peace building and long-term conflict transformation. And before I let him speak, I just want to use a metaphor I often think about him. He's kind of like an engine, engine which pulls a lot of locomotives from station to station. So, like many of us, those who know him, who worked with him, so we are like locomotives following him from station to station. And this is how I feel about David and his works. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, welcome David Gerald Newman. Thank you, David. Floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks, Kauser and Dorota, as always. An instructive presentation, but one done with such heart and passion for the work that you do in IRRICOM in our city is incredibly valuable to the co-creation through them of a better Canada and a better world. So thank you for all you do. I wanted to begin by thanking Kauser for the opportunity to give voice to many different people from around the world through his institute, which he had the vision and the commitment and did all the hard work to create with the assistance of the allies that he built after he came to Winnipeg. And that's not an easy job for somebody to do that came new to this country, let alone someone that was born here and spent a lifetime here. So congratulations, Kaiser. He began with a land acknowledgement. I want to speak to that for a moment because probably you've seen me sipping water from time to time. And one of the acknowledgement our Rotary Club does is to honor a First Nations community called Shoal Lake 40, which is on the shores on an island actually in Shoal Lake, which is the source of the drinking water in Winnipeg. And rather than Winnipeggers understanding for the decades and decades we've enjoyed fresh water from a lake, we did not appreciate that this was resulted in hardship for the people in that community, and even a movement onto an island so that they couldn't even enjoy fresh drinking water from the very lake that we were enjoying fresh drinking water from, nor could they engage in fishing and other kinds of activities because they didn't want, that is, the government authorities didn't want the water to be less than pure enough for Winnipeggers to drink. So we acknowledge and give thanks and gratitude to the people of Shoal Lake and their ancestors who make this possible. And of course, this being brought to the attention and through the Catalyst, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and others, that is not an issue as much anymore, because now there's a road connecting it. There's an ability for them to have a water purification plant and so forth. So finally, long overdue justice is about to be done. So the land acknowledgement is something which I think of, wouldn't it be wonderful if every country in the world that had been colonized began doing that in every area where there was a tribal community which disappeared under subjugation of foreign rule. Wouldn't it be fun? Wouldn't it be appropriate? Wouldn't it be meaningful if that were done everywhere throughout the world in appreciation for history? I'm speaking of COVID as being a catalyst. COVID-19 is a catalyst for us to become better people, for us to become a closer and more understanding global human family. And we do this local to global through the likes of IRCOM and newcomer supportive transition organizations. Wonderful things happen, and they reach out to each other. The community reaches out to them. And during COVID, I think there's a heightened sensitivity, heightened appreciation for each other, which is exhibited by more donations to our Winnipeg Harvest Bank, more kindness and acts of kindness to people, donations in a whole variety of ways of protective equipment, hand sanitizers, all of the kinds of things that are necessary for people to take on this health threat. But there's a purpose here, we believe, as Rotarians, and that purpose is to motivate us, help us build an awareness that things have to change in the structure of our whole world, our world order. Dorota mentioned the rule of law. I'm the lawyer. She mentioned rule of law. I'm a huge appreciator of the concept of the rule of law. The reality is that there's many gaps in it. There's a lack of enforceability. And that, again, there's a cry out, a call out. The very number of mass numbers of movements of people who become refugees is something that our sovereign state order of our world allows to happen, largely because we haven't yet got an effective global order. We do not yet have an effective way of stepping into broken states where genocides are being perpetrated and oppression and abuses and violence against women and all kinds of issues which sovereign states in some cases will not allow intervention for. We also have the huge issue of veto power at the United Nations by 5 countries in the world that can overrule everything. So we have modern empires. We have Russia and the United States and China and France and the UK that have the veto power at the United Nations to prevent these kinds of things happening. It's also no accident that all those powers possess and can utilize nuclear weapons under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1970. It's also no accident that parties to that treaty that now have nuclear weapons, and there's 4 of them, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea, are not even subject to any kind of international law treaty that they have become subject to. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty had in it a commitment to eliminate, to negotiate the elimination, disarmament worldwide. And 50 years later, we're not even close to that. And we're in a worse position with a greater threat every minute of every day of a nuclear accident or a nuclear war being triggered by one of the kinds of authoritarian leaders who are given power by their states, even democratic states like the USA, to push a button and trigger a conflagration, which can eliminate billions of people and even potentially threaten the existence of the human species on our planet. So these are huge issues. Climate change is a slow death issue, but again, it's dealing with the essential elements of life: the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we grow on our planet, the energy that we need to survive. And all of those kinds of things are now in the home of every human being everywhere on Earth. You cannot be immune from this. You cannot escape it. So the global human family is being pulled together like never before. What's happening, and we watch it every day. I watched George Floyd's funeral today. And you can see what is happening in North America. And what really is, our world is a world where arrogance and ignorance caused human beings to colonize other people, to treat them as inferiors. These were the empires. These were the people depicted in here as heroes and in statues and monuments, history books. But when we hear and we learn from the oppressed and the impoverished peoples of the world and hear their stories, and you see it through their lens and their ancestral experience, that leads us to, in the land acknowledgement the cows are pronounced, to talk about us here in Winnipeg being on the ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples, of First Nations peoples. This was their First Nations. This was their territory. And they did things their own way for thousands of years. They wouldn't even have heard about the Old Testament or a Bible or a Quran or anything like that. So here we are, the sovereign nations of the world, Canada and the US, created out of colonization. So what are we doing now as we go through a decolonization process? I believe the steps are, first of all, awareness. That's why I belong to honoring Indigenous peoples. That's why the mission of the Rotary Peacebuilder Club of Winnipeg is serving the cause of peace by nurturing understanding and compassionate action. We collaborate to promote inclusion, human dignity, justice, and a sustainable earth. Our vision is that every community is where everyone can experience peace within and beyond ourselves. So awareness, understanding is important. Rotary International has what is called an objective, and one of those objectives, 4 objectives, is building understanding, goodwill, and peace. Modern day Rotary, which I suggest is what we're doing here in Winnipeg, is suggesting that peace is not just a romantic, abstract, idealistic notion. Peace is something that can be measurable. And an Institute for Economics and Peace that Rotary International has a strategic alliance with now gives it a definition and also provides country measures of progress. It's really attitudes and institutions and really an infrastructure which allows communities and countries to become, have less violence, more prosperity, and simply be more capable of getting along with each other than countries that do not have what is called positive peace. So positive peace has an academic meaning, the kind of thing that Kauser studied in his PhD program, Johan Galtung and other great academics. It means the same thing, but by giving a practical definition to it, it means that peace is what we do. Peace is action. Pieces are creating the instruments for us to get along within our community. We also have the concept, which we've embraced as Peacebuilder Committee and our district World Peace Partners, of peace literacy. Peace literacy, essentially, we say we're at the pre-literate stage of peace literacy. Because who's really teaching this anymore? It used to be parents, families, it used to be faith groups, and our school systems really haven't treated this as important as reading, writing, arithmetic. But we see what's more important than the discipline and skills and values to get along. As the author of this of books on peace literacy and creator of a curriculum now being evolving in our K-12 school system in Manitoba has said. Can you imagine going out and playing basketball for the first time, a group of 5 people, with another team that couldn't play basketball? It would just be a mess. If you're going to play in a symphony and play musical instruments, and you went there without practice and years of commitment to an instrument and then learning how to play together, it'd be a mess. So why don't we give the same kind of attention to peace literacy, the discipline and the skills and the practices to be able to get along? So this is the kind of thing, once we have awareness of our history, and once we understand that there are means to advance practical peace in our world, and we acknowledge our history. So you have awareness, you acknowledge the history and the shame of it. You don't get bogged down about it. You apologize for it. But then you build relationships. And building relationships with Indigenous people and people from other countries and newcomers, and between Indigenous people and newcomers, is really the work that we do. And what do? I say the work we do, we inspire and facilitate that work because it's the right thing to do. And it's necessary for the survival of the human race. So when we deal with COVID-19, and we think of this as such a major catalyst, I think of IRCOM, and I think of the newcomers, and I think of every one of these amazing people, resilient people that have come here and can be co-creators of a new country. But how do you co-create a new country when you haven't had years of experience that I have, having been born here, and the academic experience and scholarship that Kauser has experienced over the last 10 years? Well, the amazing thing as I see it is, IRCOM and Rotarians can help people work through systems. They can test the systems, and they can knock out and break down the obstacles to them becoming successful, empowered, respected Canadians. So this means systems change. Every individual who's a marginalized person, an oppressed person in our community, can test those systems and try, and with support, with allies, make them humanized, bring compassion into them, bring about systems change. And my experience is, out of IRCOM, you've got people that are doing that. They're challenging the systems and testing them, and they're becoming better because they're forced to understand them. So I see IRCOM, I see COVID-19, I see Rotary, and I see our Indigenous peoples in our city and in our remote communities, each becoming the co-creators of a country which can be decolonized and can be a model for the world to do the same kind of thing in their cultural different ways, and to help us together build a global rule of law, a global order, where delegated powers go to a central agency accountable to all the states in the world, and where we no longer have 5 states of the world controlling our world and controlling our systems. And we have those renegades that have nuclear weapons. We have them become subjected to the rule of law. So the little things we do every way in our city and in communities throughout the world can contribute to this. Having networks that cross borders, that are not limited by borders, point out that borders are merely political means to manage things like COVID-19 within your boundaries, but they should not be borders that prevent common humanity from uniting and doing good in our world. Thanks for the opportunity to speak a message which I'm very pleased to put across, because it's disruptive and many people don't want to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for your very interesting part of discussion. And we always love to hear from David on these hot button issues. And in this part of the webinar, we open up for the Q&A session. By now, we have received a number of questions from the audience, but as a privileged moderator, let me put forward the first question to our panelist, Dorota. Dorota, I was listening very intently as you, explained that Canada has a legal obligation, according to 1982 Charter of Rights, to at least listen to the condition of any asylum seeker. If that is the case, what do you think is the rationale behind the March decision of Canadian government to return the asylum seekers back to USA and vice versa? What is the motivation of Canadian government to take such a decision?
Well, to be honest, it was a very short-sighted decision, and I think it was a decision that was likely led by public fear and not by good policy, and certainly not by strong political leadership. So I think it was a decision that was made at a moment, thinking that if we close the borders, that we will absolutely stop the spread of COVID. And I just want to say that stopping the spread of COVID and protecting everyone's health and everyone's lives is something that needs to happen in Canada, in the US, in every country of the world, because until all of us are safe and healthy and well, none of us are safe and healthy and well. But it was also a decision that I believe was made with a mind to resources. So was it possible to keep the borders open to refugee claimants and to put in place mandatory isolation, mandatory quarantine? Was it possible to do adequate screening and make sure that people had an opportunity to get screening and testing immediately? Was it possible to ensure that we could basically place any refugee claimants in safe and adequate housing where they would have all the resources necessary to wait out that 14-day period or a 21-day period, at which point we would be assured of their good health? It was absolutely possible. It's always been possible. It was a question of good policy and use of resources. And this is why I said justice is expensive. And really, our adherence to our principles and our ideals and our laws and upholding our own justice system is something that has to cost us. And it costs us in critical moments, not in easy moments. In easy moments, it's easy to say that, you know, our borders are open and that we abide by international law and we uphold our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and we protect the human rights of refugee claimants. When it is easy, that is an easy thing to say. The question is whether or not we can stay in that space when it gets really, really hard. And it got hard because everyone got afraid. But instead of working with communities, instead of trying to get everyone to understand that this is a global response of a global family, that we needed to ensure everyone's safety, and that this was not the moment in which we compromise basic human rights, we let that fear lead us into injustice. We let that fear lead us into breaking laws. We let that fear lead us into costing people their safety and their lives and their dignity. So it was short-sighted and it was elitist, and quite frankly, it was led by racism. It was led by racism because the other, who is on the other side of the border, who is a lesser human being than I on this side of the border, should certainly be the first to forfeit any right to their human right and the protection of their person and to their liberty and to their good health, because they're on that other side. And their health and their well-being and their life and their liberty should cost me nothing. And when we are in crisis, I want you to save my life before you save theirs. That's how that decision was made. And it was the wrong decision, and it was a shameful decision, and it should be a decision that is reversed as quickly as possible. And it should be a decision that is challenged, and it should be challenged, and it should create change in law, in structure, and in systems immediately. It cannot just go to an apology. An apology without change is meaningless and empty.
Thank you very much, Dorota. My next question is to David Newman. David, we have heard you talking about states' responsibility for reconciliation, ranging from indigenous people awareness and from nuclear weapons. But my question to you today is, what do you think is the best method to deal with the state, i.e., the power? Because state takes arbitrary decisions, and as we have heard, Dorota, uh, right now she was critiquing about Canada's decision of halting asylum process for the time being. So, what is the best method of dealing with the state? Because most of the solution actually lies in the hands of the policymakers, politicians, and people like those sitting in the top of the hierarchy?
Well, that's a great question, and I wouldn't be able to provide any experience or expertise had I not served as an elected official and been in cabinet in a government. And I learned from being in those positions as a person who was not a partisan politician, but a person who chose to run and was supported by the premier of the day, running into his third term of election. I told him that I would offer myself for public service if the government supported economic stewardship looking generations ahead, environmental stewardship, sustainability looking many generations ahead, and social justice looking many generations ahead. And I thought that would be the end of my political career, because I was only going to run if he said yes. And he said, I want you to run in so and so. So my life changed. And they obviously want to get me elected, which means they probably gave more than I deserved as a person to get elected. And I got elected. To my astonishment, my whole career changed. I was the chairman of a law firm at the time, after it had its best year ever. And I was the head of the labor relations and environmental law departments, and I had been the managing partner. So I was in a position where I, upon entering cabinet, gave up everything. I gave up all of my clients, and I became a public servant. But what I had done for 50 years of my practice, 50 years of my career, which is 50 years now of law practice and my period in government, is I optimized my freedom and independence so that I could say the kinds of things I said to the premier, so I could commit myself to public service in a way that was uncompromising and fearless. And I was given enough support from the premier's office that systemic change was possible. So I came out of it believing that the art of the possible is politics. But if you get enough mobilized, committed, free and independent people elected, change can happen. And if you get enough committed countries impacted by people like that in a democracy, you can change the United Nations. You can change the world. The world is crying out for Canada to be an example. And it isn't. Canada isn't an example of it. We've had to acknowledge what we have done to Indigenous peoples and the shame of it. We have nothing to boast about here. The only thing that we can hold out as evidence that things can change is our Truth and Reconciliation report, is our Constitution Act, 1982, and our Charter and our Supreme Court of Canada cases, which have done some justice to Indigenous peoples. We can hold out the apology of our Prime Minister and some of the things that we've done. But these are just a small, tiny step towards a commitment to become a government of and for all people and for justice for all. And right now in North America, we have a cry out for that kind of leadership in the United States. But that cry out, that shout out is to Canada as well. So Canada shouldn't be, Canadians are going to have to make a sacrifice. I like what Dorota says. Every single Canadian is going to have to make a sacrifice, as if we were going into a war. We're not risking our lives. We're just going to have to invest. We're going to have to take the heat for taking a position different than the United States, taking a position different from the UK, taking a position within NATO on nuclear weapons, and walking the talk and taking a stand for morality and common humanity, humanitarian reasoning for human rights. Take a stand. Take a stand. That's what Canada has to do, a stand and an example, but they can only do it in a democracy if we citizens are prepared to make that kind of commitment. The world depends on it, because if we can't do this in for example, Rotary, which is a service above self-organization, if we're not prepared to do it, Rotarians, mainstream Rotarians don't do it. If Canadians who are amongst prosperity and privilege and freedom and parliamentary democracy aren't going to do it, then what hope is there for any other country to do it? We have this obligation and responsibility to the whole world. And you know who's pushing us there more than anybody? Our Indigenous people. Let's learn from them. Let's honor them. Let's make it a country where we show understanding and compassion and leading a good life. Means more than GDP. It means more than having a legal system that throws people in jail when they do something wrong.
Thank you very much, David. Now we'll take questions from audience. There are a couple of them already coming in. Here is one of the questions, and I think Dorota would be in better position to start. And David, feel free to jump in if you want to add or add your comments.
Well, I think I spoke to this a bit. So the CBSA is the Canadian Border Service Agency, and it is around the COVID-19 situation, and certainly around what role Canada can play regarding asylum seekers being able to enter Canada, and certainly during the start of the Trump presidency in 2017. So one of the fundamental pieces that is being challenged right now before the Supreme Court is the Safe Third Country Agreement. So the Safe Third Country Agreement between Canada and the United States assumes that both countries abide by and uphold international law, that both countries have fair, transparent, well-resourced, robust refugee determination systems. The Safe Third Country Agreement believes that both countries protect the human rights of refugees, that they protect the right to seek asylum and the right to have your asylum claim heard, and the right to freedom and the right to liberty as you await that decision, and the right to work and access education as you await that decision. But we know that this is not the case in the United States. We know that in the United States, in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands, refugee claimants are imprisoned without cause for months, if not years, awaiting any opportunity, that there is a denial of access to work visas or green cards that allows them to participate in the economy and sustain themselves and their livelihoods, that there is not an equitable access to education for themselves or their children as they wait a decision. So the United States is not a safe third country. And so when Mr. Trump went into power and began to disseminate hate and racism and empower that same hate and racism, when he stood in the way of basic human rights and dignity, when he identified countries and basically prevented people from those communities to come to the United States, to work in the United States, to visit or to seek asylum in the United States, simply because of their country of origin, he flew directly. He tore apart the Safe Third Country Agreement. And Canada should have immediately stepped up and said, this agreement is nullified. This agreement does not stand if you are not committed to a robust and transparent and fair and well-resourced refugee determination system. And he made that abundantly clear immediately. And what we should have done is remove the Safe Third Country Agreement, which means that anyone who is seeking refugee protection, anyone who has a well-founded fear of persecution, whether they're coming through the United States, whether they're coming through our own international airports, whether they're arriving as temporary foreign workers or as international students, and then submitting their claims once they're safely within Canada, we should have that. Again, that was a defining moment. That was a moment of crisis. That was a moment that was not easy. And what we did is we took the easy and unjust route. And what we should have done is said, if you have a well-founded fear of persecution, Canada has an obligation to hear you. And that should not have excluded people who may have entered in through the United States, or may have started a claim and been imprisoned, or may have been subjected to bigotry and to racism and to hate, because that is not a safe country. That is not, it is fundamentally rests on the idea that the country is safe, and that country was not safe for those refugee claimants. And so Canada, that was the, yet again, a moment, not in history, a moment in the present in which we failed to uphold justice.
Thank you so much. Sorry, David, do you wanted to jump?
No, I have no expertise in that specific situation. I'm aware of it generally, and I really do strongly support what Dorota had to say.
Thank you. Next question is for Dr. David Newman. So here is the question, and if you kindly respond to the audience.
I'm very conscious of the learning experience Canadians have gone through because of our versions of the George Floyd teaching moment in the United States, and many others there, and there have been many others here in relation to Indigenous peoples, but not just Indigenous peoples, also other minorities, especially in places like Toronto and Halifax, where there are African Canadian communities. So I'll deal specifically with the gas link pipeline situation being a teaching moment, in that what it has done is shown that pre-Confederation, we have rights that are not limited, not constrained by our Constitution and our laws. And when we start recognizing that there are laws, essentially existing treaties and rights that are protected, not only in Section 35, but even by our Supreme Court in effectively what is the common law of Indigenous peoples, or the international law respecting Indigenous peoples. I think we have a way of understanding that the rule of law can be used as a weapon to subjugate and prevent legitimate protest of effectively trespassing on lands of Indigenous peoples. But that's sort of a narrow legal issue. The broader legal issue is, you think about it, our laws before our country developed its own common laws all came from the UK, and from the French system they came from France. So the common law in our country was colonial. We've ignored thousands of years of unwritten stories and ways of resolving conflict in North America, and that means we've missed the richness and the differences and the cultural benefits of another way of finding resolutions to conflict and determining what is justice. Is justice through an adversarial process based on punishing wrong? Or is a better solution restoring communities and restoring relationships between perpetrators and survivors, victims? So these are big, big questions. In terms of hydro in the north, I was once the minister responsible for hydro. And the kinds of issues that have resulted from, again, arrogance and ignorance in terms of developments and our attitudes and understanding of Indigenous peoples led to multiple injustices, which led to comprehensive flood agreements being signed, some when I was in office. It led to acknowledgement of violations of treaties and the restoration of lands that people are entitled to. So there's a lot of good justification for the First Nations people of this province that they have been treated wrongly. And we have a duty to do reparation, not just not just words, not just acknowledgements, apologies, reparation. And that's what the modern day solutions are, these comprehensive settlements. And there's a lot more to be made. And every one of these situations where there's claims of biased or racist application of our legal system, it cries out for our legal system to change. It has to be a justice system which is accessible by, and provides justice and felt justice for communities that are not fairly represented and heard in our current civil and criminal justice systems in Manitoba or anywhere in Canada. This has to change. It has to change throughout North America. And I can tell you that Rotarians that I'm working with cross-border are very committed to doing this. And we're working closely with the American Rights Fund, Native American Rights Fund in the USA, and progressive tribal courts and so forth in the US. And the Michigan Supreme Court is very progressive in the US, and trying to get best practices incorporated here. We should also be looking at having Indigenous courts in our country.
Thank you, David. Just to be conscious about time, I'll take the last question from the audience. And this is again, somebody was very much inspired by the talks of David Newman. Here's the question.
Well, I would suggest one immediate thing, which I have decided is the most life-threatening, human species threatening risk that we have in our planet right now is nuclear abolition, nuclear weapons. So nuclear abolition is the only way out of this. So what can Canada do? Canada within NATO, and I can say this, Independent Senator Mary Lou McPhedran has written a paper about this. We've had conferences that have shown support for a concept that Canada should stand up within NATO and be heard. But Canada should partner, should be a signatory to the international coalition, the abolition of nuclear weapons. ICAN that won the Nobel Peace Prize. And Canada did not even participate at the UN when 122 countries in our world, the majority of countries in our world, supported and signed that treaty. And right now, I think it's 38 countries have now ratified that within their legal systems around the world. When 50 have ratified, it becomes a treaty. Canada did not even participate in the negotiation for the abolition of nuclear weapons throughout the world. I think that's a disgrace, and I think it was suppressed because he didn't want to alienate our NATO allies and the United States of America particularly.
Thank you so much. So we are at the last part of our webinar. Before I let the speakers go, I just would like to listen final words, last comments, insights from both the panelists. So I'd invite Dorota first, if you have final words for our audience.
I think what I would want to close with is just to say that I don't think at this point in time trying to imagine a world post-COVID is returning to the world pre-COVID. I also don't think that it's taking the world pre-COVID and making minor changes or minor improvements, and that we'll be where we ought to be. What we're really needing to do is a full dismantle. It is a full dismantling of systems. It is a rewriting of laws. It is a rewriting of structures. It is a de-weaponizing, not just countries of nuclear weapons, but it is de-weaponizing hostile, bodies and hostile powers, and some of those powers, including militaries and including police forces, have to be de-weaponized so that we can actually put in place what the intent of that was, because the intent of that was never to brutalize. The intent was never to oppress. The intent was never to control. And that is exactly what we have. And it will not be a small change. It will not be a change in policy or a change in their slogans. It will not be enough to change the tagline and to say that we're dedicated to a different future. You have to disarm. You have to disarm, de-weaponize, deconstruct, dismantle. And I think David is right. There are completely different systems. There are completely different ways of looking at the world. There are completely different pathways to justice. There are completely different pathways to healing. And we have imported a Eurocentric, colonial, white, Western approach. And it's the wrong approach. It is the wrong framework. It is the wrong lens. It is completely wrong. And it needs to be taken apart, taken out, and we start again.
Now I invite David to have the last words.
Well, with that background, which I endorse completely, I have very little to say except how do you do this? I mean, how do you do this? It's amazing what any individual can do. If you're lucky to have a spouse like I have, if you're lucky to have children and grandchildren like I have, if you're lucky to have friends that I have in Winnipeg and in my region and around the world, and you together find out ways that you within your own home and your extended family and your community and your region and your country can influence dramatic change, like we're going into a third world war. And we're going to do it proactively. We're not going to wait until millions are killed. With that kind of attitude, let's change, co-create a new Canada, because if Canada doesn't do it, no one else is going to do it. Join Rotary. Join any organization which is a movement for this kind of change. Persuade your MLA, persuade your city councillor, persuade your MP, persuade any area of influence where you have influence, your workplace, your friends, your neighborhoods, and those representatives, and tell them time for a change. We will settle for nothing less. None of this lip service. Are you committed to this kind of serious change or not? If not, I'm not going to vote for you.
Thank you very much, panelists. First of all, it's really CRRIC is absolutely proud to host you today, and we have listened one of the very brilliant ways of putting things into context that we are facing now due to COVID. And we thank all of you for your time and energy and passion. Dear audience, IRCOM is doing a wonderful job, a splendid job supporting immigrants and refugees in Manitoba in general. Please support IRCOM through your actions, through your time, energy, volunteerism, in any way you can. And as you have heard, lastly, join Rotary because that is one of the ways that you can bring change to the world. And here I end today's episode. Thank you very much once again tuning in with CRIC's webinar. And thank you, Dorota and David Newman.
Thank
Have a
you,
nice day.
Councillor. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.